In this episode, I'm talking about neurotheology with Bryan Spoon, who's a pastor, chaplain, and neuroscience YouTuber who runs the channel Neurotheology. Now, neurotheology is the branch of neuroscience that seeks to understand the relationship between the human brain and religion. I loved having this conversation with Bryan because even though we differ on our religious views, I'm an atheist and he's a Christian pastor, we had a fruitful and amicable discussion about neuroscience, mindfulness, spirituality, and the many approaches to living a good and satisfying life. Bryan Spoon is a Board Certified Chaplain through the Association of Professional Chaplains. He is also an ordained priest within the Episcopal Church, currently serving with his wife Elisabeth in Mexico City. After serving as a chaplain in 3 Level 1 trauma hospital centers, he is now currently a doctoral candidate in practical theology at the University of Aberdeen's Center for Spirituality, Health, and Disability. He is the author of Neuroscience and the Fruit of the Spirit, host of the website spiritualneuroscience.com, which focuses on the correlation of neuroscience with spirituality from scholarly research and diverse faith backgrounds, as well as a host of the website christianneuroscience.com, which features top-rated and diverse Christian neuroscience resources. He is a strong and vocal advocate that amid our spiritual differences, we all have much to learn and share with one another. Now, without further ado, my interview with Bryan Spoon. Okay, so I am here with Bryan Spoon, and I want to first, I will have read your bio for the audience, but maybe you can tell us a little bit about your background and what led you to what you study, both on kind of the neuroscience side as well as in being a chaplain.
Well, you had just interviewed Dr. Andrew Newberg, and actually one of his books was one of my entry points into this genre. It was How God Changes Your Brain. He's been a really big inspiration for me. I'm a Anglican priest, and to all the viewers, there's going to be no proselytizing whatsoever. I'm a Board Certified Chaplain, and great respect for all different spiritualities, religions. So just know I'm coming from that perspective. But Dr. Newberg also looking for commonalities, things that, as one human race, that, love and unity. He talked about the intensity of experiences, surrender, these kind of things. I think a lot of what we're seeing from neuroscience, that a lot of what's, I think, best in spirituality and religion is something that's very universal to all of us, even if we do disagree on some very large and essential points that, I really feel like, where he's kind of coming from. So that's kind of how, to some degree, I got into it, but love seeing that video and love what he's doing.
Oh yeah, that's great. That's really how I got introduced to this area as well. And he's just a really interesting guy, really interesting thinker. So it's a great point of overlap. So I have to admit, I've been so focused on your YouTube channel, which for everybody in the audience is Neurotheology, and I will have linked to that below. But I admit I haven't read your book. So I believe it's called Neuroscience and the Fruit of the Spirit. I was wondering if you could kind of maybe describe some of the central ideas of that book and what that phrase, for people unfamiliar with it, what fruit of the Spirit means.
Yeah, so within Christianity, Paul, a lot of the letters of the New Testament are written by Paul. And in the letter of Galatians, chapter 5, he talks about the fruit of the Spirit being love and joy and peace. But there are 9 of them. But I concentrate on the fruit of the Spirit. And there's, I think, a lot of overlap of the fruit of the Spirit within other traditions as well. But specifically, Jesus says, you will know them by their fruit. And he has a number of sayings that talk about being fruitful, that he's the vine and we are to bear fruit. The Episcopal Church in the United States just did a large survey asking what non-Christians thought of Christians, and some of the highest responses were judgmental, hypocritical, and that being unfortunate in an area of growth. I think, especially for our community to see that when we look at the neuroscience of when we practice love and joy and peace. So what I did is when I read Newberg, it was probably about 11 years or so ago, not long after that book I mentioned came out. I started diving into all sorts of books and reading as much as I could, and wanting to draw into just more knowledge of that. And being a hospital chaplain, level 1 trauma centers, a lot of my time was as a pediatric chaplain. So seeing like transgenerational trauma, prejudice, just the horrors of, gun violence, and I just could go on and on. But anyway, and then there's also this whole realm of the social determinants of healthcare, and what's actually being able to, be offered care to in a hospital is actually it's like 10 to 20% at most of the entirety of what could be modified. Those would be the social determinants, like behavioral, or, all of these different things, where being able to write a book and say, if we practice these things, we're going to be healthier, being able to approach one another. So the book is very Christian. However, it also draws in, like the Book of Joy with the Dalai Lama and Desmond Tutu, reflecting on that, and a lot of other resources. I think as a chaplain that, I've learned so much from so many different people, and I feel like as Christians, we can adopt a lot of what also inspires our own faith as Christians. So it's a book that's very Christian, but at the same time, I would say that the fruit of the Spirit are largely universal, I think, to humanity, and that there's something about them that most of us try to practice. But I think central to my argument is that as people of faith, that we have so much to learn from one another, and that I think getting along, and Jesus also saying, loving our neighbors, the example of the Good Samaritan, that we are really called to love one another, even amidst our differences. So it's a book that's very Christian, but at the same time, it's drawing upon a lot of other resources to give Christians, I think, more background into experiencing the riches that what neuroscience is teaching us about love and joy. And there's so much coming on, and it's very inspiring, and it's almost like every day there's something new. So that's kind of in a nutshell.
I love that idea. As a non-Christian and non-religious person, I really appreciate that mindset of looking at, within your own tradition with the best of what is there, and then also looking at other traditions, and then reaching out to modern science. And I love that approach. I think we could all benefit from taking a little bit of that mindset for sure. But now I want to get into, I asked Dr. Newberg this question as well, and I want to see how you approach it. So how do you define spirituality, and how would you differentiate it or not from religiousness or religion?
Yeah, it's a great question. I thought his answer was actually well said. I think in part, drawing it back to whomever is defining it. It's, but there are some, I think, things that kind of anchor spirituality as well as religion. Religion being more of a community focus, doctrines, agreed upon practices, ritual, liturgies. You can get into the etymology of the word religion as well, and being bound to some degree, or rebound. But then spirituality, I would say, my own personal perspective would be more of like a broad definition, is that I would think it would be really a universal, that we're all spiritual, that the spirit is something that kind of defines our person. Someone call it a soul or self, some kind of unifying aspect of ourselves. And within the literature, or just within my perspective, it would be something along the lines of, how we connect to the moment, to ourselves, to others, to the sacred, to nature. Those are some aspects of it, but it's really very personal. But I would definitely be of the perspective of more of a broad, like a broad picture.
Yeah. So within that, what do you think about it sounds like that would be open to a kind of secular spirituality, if that term is not an oxymoron. that kind of, for me, that would mean not invoking anything supernatural, which I suppose we might disagree on what constitutes supernatural, but do you see room for that kind of non-religious, or I suppose the best term is just secular spirituality?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, these are some of the discussions that are happening within the Association of Professional Chaplains, and I think just happening in general. That there's disagreement, but I think having a secular spirituality is something that more people are finding. He mentioned, Dr. Newberg, that there are a growing number of spiritual but not religious. There are a number of books. Oxford has a dictionary of psychology of spirituality, and so trying to define a little bit more what we're talking about. But absolutely, I think there's room for spirituality, however we understand it. I mean, even if it's coming from believing that we're material and that we're nothing more than our brains, that we still have we understand ourselves, most of us, as a unified self, and that self has some kind of aspects to it that many people would define as our spirit, and that spirit doesn't necessarily have to be metaphysical. I would define it as metaphysical. And so I think being a chaplain, being someone that is respectful of differences, being able to communicate and share what our experiences are, to grow with one another. So there's absolutely room. Absolutely.
Yeah. I mean, I guess from my perspective, I guess the word spirituality for me refers to, I guess I would call it like this category of experiences that is available to humans, and I suppose possibly other animals, but definitely to humans, where some of the things that you mentioned, kind of or some of the things I suppose that Dr. Newberg mentioned, like feelings of unity with whether it's God or the universe, and these. I mean, I think it could even. It's so, as I'm trying to define it now, I'm running up against that. Well, how other people define it is going to affect the way I think about it. But yeah, I see it as sort of a class of experiences that are outside of the normal realm of experiences, and which bring us into, I think, probably a more positive mindset, both about ourselves and then how we treat others. And I think that's too broad to really be a great definition, but that's sort of where I start with those things.
Sure. No, I mean, if it works for you and it's bringing more meaning and purpose, and obviously through your videos and how you connect and want to share different perspectives, I appreciate where you're coming from with that. And
yeah, well, thank you, and as you as well. And this was something I hadn't planned on asking you, but it just occurred to me. What is your thinking about the current research into like psychedelic drugs, like psilocybin and LSD, and these kinds of sort of life-changing experiences that some people are having, in whether it's treating depression or something along those lines? How do you view that personally, it through the lens of spirituality?
I mean, it can be a bit of a controversial subject for a number of people. I know Johns Hopkins has a research center, and as I've researched more on neuroscience and spirituality and faith, there are a growing number of articles on it. So I think it's, to some degree, fairly new for a lot of people. Some of the research coming out of Johns Hopkins, that there's some very strong evidence that has been very helpful for some, but it is to some degree controversial, and that there are certain prejudices, and I don't know if I could offer a complete answer, having, it's not my specialty, but I know it's something that's very much on the forefront of a lot of healthcare and science for some research centers and some people, and that it's fascinating. I think there are things about it that are very fascinating, but it does come with some controversy and some questions. And I think I would say it's an area to tread a bit lightly. So, but I don't think I would be expert enough, other than knowing that it's something that a lot of people are are questioning, and that there is some evidence that shows that as a therapy that it has shown to be very effective. But not being a complete expert, I wouldn't want to put my foot in my mouth. So that'll.
Fair enough. Fair enough. That's great. All right. Well, let's move on to some topics within neurotheology. Some of the things you've talked about on your channel. I think that you have such a good ability of giving a nice overview of what these. A lot of your videos are focused on individual brain regions, and you do a good job of explaining what kind of the overall function of those brain regions are, and then how they're involved or may be involved in spiritual experiences. And I love that. And I wondered if we could take maybe some of these lessons that you've outlined in your videos and just sort of give them to the audience. I think they're so valuable. So in one video, I can't remember exactly which one it is, but you tell this parable of the two wolves. And I think it's a Cherokee story, a Cherokee two wolves story. And it's kind of about how our brains can change for the better or worse. And I was wondering if you could tell that story or explain, what the meaning is to you.
Yeah, so it's a Cherokee Native American story. Basically, there's an elder who's asked by a young person saying, I feel like there are these two sides of myself. There's this angry, hungry, kind of ravenous wolf inside, and then there's this kind of loving, kind wolf inside. And this young person says to the elder, like, which one am I, or who's going to win? And the elder says, well, it depends on the one you feed. So taking that to a neuroscience perspective, looking at it from Duhigg, the Power of Habit, or James Clear with his Atomic Habits, or there's reams of research papers coming out about how we engage our lives, what we do consistently over time. Even writings of the ancients, like Aristotle, talks about these things, that what we consistently do largely becomes who we are. So it depends on which wolf we're feeding. So knowing that there is a bit of a battle in us, in spirituality, I think each one of us is a person. Like we're a self, so we're going to be selfish, but then we live in community, so we're always thinking about ourselves in community. So there's always, I think, going to be that tension that is a challenge, just an existential challenge. But how do we live in a way that our self can incorporate and be more loving, thinking about the golden rule or forgiving, this kind of thing. But no, I think it's a brilliant parable, brilliant story, and one that really, it's just so true that.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, like, what would you say is the way that we could apply that lesson in our lives to change our brains for the better? I mean, what are some of the practices that might allow us to feed the good wolf rather than the bad one?
Well, just within, like, say, my own faith tradition of Christianity, thinking about a word origin, John 3:16 is one of the most probably well-known Bible verses amongst Christians. For God so loved the world that he gave his only son, that whoever believes in him shall have eternal life, whatever. Not whatever, but don't want to keep on going with a lot of extra scripture for people that aren't necessarily Christian. But within Christianity, within the Koine Greek, the particular word used for believe in him is eis. It's pistuum in eis. And eis it's a preposition. It means in, but it also means into, for the purpose of, or to, which, going back to that analogy of the wolves, if our faith is to believe into or for the purpose of, it's a totally different thing than, say, if I were to believe in being healthy. I can believe in being healthy, but from personal experience, I know that's very different from actually being healthy or living like into patterns of healthiness. So our faith, or who we are, and aside from being Christian, I think how we believe, whatever our spirituality is, how we engage with the world, what we're drawn to, that is, feeding those wolves that, as we live out our faith is embodied, it's enacted, it is very much, it's alive, we are a living being in terms of our faith. And sometimes it gets, I think, relegated to a mental acceptance, or, I believe in, and that if we're going to believe, I think it should be personally more, how do I be a healthier person? Because if I just believe in being healthy, it's not going to help me or anybody else. So that's just kind of, I think, the take I would, from my personal experience of my own health habits that have not necessarily led to being a more healthy person.
All right. Well, that's fair. All right. So I love that story. And you have a really nice way with words. And in this one video, I'm sorry, I can't remember the name of it, but I can look it up and link it. It's a video on goodness, I think, actually. And you say, I'm just going to quote you a little bit here. And you say, at the core of goodness is a zeal for the truth that is active and correcting. Unless we correct for falsehood and ignorance, then we will contribute to the brokenness of the world. So I love that. I think that's a curious and really, I like that link between truth and goodness. I was wondering if you could talk about how you see that connection between truth and goodness, maybe in this context or broader context, but however you want to take that.
Yeah, I mean, that's one way goodness has been seen by some of the interpreters of that particular fruit of the Spirit within Christianity. I would say absolutely that, the closer we draw toward truth, the more goodness there is. And even within Christianity, there's been, thinking of Galileo, that, seeing the world as a larger place than what we knew before, and that we continually make more and more discoveries about how beautiful and wondrous this world is we live in, that being able to incorporate that, but it holds in tension some of our traditions or understandings, and it can be very challenging in that sense for many of us that are coming from a particular faith background. But I think largely that my understanding of ultimate reality is that it must be truth, and that if ultimate reality is truth, some of us will call that God. That ultimate reality, many of us would also call it love, and that if we can find love and truth in a sense of ultimate reality, the closer we can get to that truth and love, I think it's going to draw us more and more together, even as we disagree on some enormously important points. But I really feel like that correcting sense of, not living in hypocrisy, being truth tellers, that regardless of whatever the ultimate truth is, that no matter what we disagree on the ultimate truth is, that goodness of loving people that we're very different from, of drawing close to people, of not being hypocritical, of holding ourselves accountable to the truth, that it's going to be healthier for each one of us. So there's that entire aspect that I feel like we don't even necessarily have to approach some of the unknowables or the things that some of us just completely disagree on. But there's this enormous realm that I think that we're seeing played out in culture and politics and so many other things right now, that it's been a real challenge. And that I think that goodness, if we can humble ourselves and surrender more of some of the things that Dr. Newberger talking about, that if we can find that humility or surrender, that it's going to, I think, open us up in a way to have more goodness.
Yes. Yeah. And it's a couple different points there. I mean, I think your point about connecting where we can connect, we'll disagree about maybe fundamental things and other trivial things, but if we can connect and we can collaborate, if a priest can speak to an atheist and we can come up with a good collaboration here, then why not do it? Why not engage in that? That seems so important. And then the other thing that came to mind for me with that was the importance of honesty. I think it's so important. I think you were sort of expressing this, that we may not even know the answer to these things, but if we're honest about what we believe and why we believe it, it can do so much good in the world.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. Well, that I love that point. So now I kind of want to move on to something that seems to, maybe in your more recent videos, it seems to be a theme that's popping up a little bit more. But in any case, in one of your videos on the vagus nerve and vagal tone, you explained that the vagus nerve has a lot to do with our kind of our mental health and well-being. And I was wondering if you could describe just what that nerve is and why it's so important, or if not that specific point, maybe we could just discuss why the feelings from the body are so important in suffering, well-being, and spirituality in general.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I think it's so important for all of us to connect more to our bodies, and that the 10th cranial nerve, it comes from the brainstem down through the body, connecting to our organs. So it's something that can be largely out of our conscious awareness, how our organs connect to our emotions. And I think that's a big point that I and many others, like Bessel van der Kolk or Body Keeps the Score, or there's others out there that are. Babette Rothschild is one name. She's doing excellent work in this genre, and coming from a very secular place, and I think many different therapists can draw from. That if we can, I think at first kind of understand our bodies more. One of the things I was explaining in the video, having that habit of awareness, that when our heart starts to beat faster, that can be a sign that we have an amygdala hijack that some people will be aware of, that, our fight or flight response of stress, that when we get stressed, something happens in our body. And if we're conscious of what's happening, then we can kind of cue ourselves. I talk about habit loops and this kind of thing, that being more conscious of our body, we can be more conscious of what has been unconscious. So stimulating the vagus nerve, there are different ways to do it, a number of different ways, but one that I mentioned in the video is diaphragmatic breathing. If we can breathe deeply, we're all in those conversations where someone says something that might raise the stress level, or we're watching television, something might raise the stress level. If we have that awareness of, okay, I'm stressed out, I can feel my heart racing, my hands are clenching, maybe my jaw. If we can be more aware of these things, then that a habit loop grows. We know what cues us, but if we can start breathing some diaphragmatic breathing, what that does, it stimulates the vagus nerve, which our organs actually, not only does the brain communicate with the body, but especially through the vagus nerve, that our organs are communicating to our brain. So when we're at peace and in rest, we talk about our system of rest, that the belly, that a lot of those nerves are actually coming and kind of telling the mind. But also when we breathe diaphragmatically, it's telling the brain basically just calm down. And that gives us more access to our prefrontal cortex. So one thing that I recommend is, when we feel those things, do some deep breathing, kind of calm down. And then there's some other exercises. I think you mentioned a bit with Dr. Newberg about, meditation, and there's certain aspects of meditation that are fairly universal. I would say that, having a third person perspective of our first person experience is one way of defining how we can view mindfulness. And the more we grow in that, the things that are unconscious, we can be more conscious of. And that ventral vagal, the vagus nerve having, two branches. The ventral is more of our, rest, peace, calm. And then the dorsal is the back, where that would be much more, if we're so stressed, we go into just a complete freeze. So when that's being activated, so it's a bit of neuroscience, but it's a neuroscience channel. So people are going to know these or want to know more about them. But being able to activate through some belly breathing, through calming down, accessing our prefrontal cortex. And then the more mindful we are, a lot more of our inhibitory aspects of our prefrontal cortex can kind of draw down some of the limbic systems, stress responses. And we can also start thinking more abstractly about like, who am I, and who am I in relation to others, rather than being these kind of unconscious habits. But hopefully that wasn't too tangential. But I think the vagus nerve is very fascinating. Something that I think within several years, I'd love to see as part of a kind of a vocabulary that everyone would be able to say, oh, I just need to kind of set my ventral vagal back in.
Yeah. No, I don't think that got too tangential at all. And I will link to that video. You go through a number of different techniques. So people should definitely check that out. So you've touched on this a couple of times, and this is something we talked about a little bit before we started recording, but a lot of your videos seem to point to or indicate the problem of deepening political divisions between the left and right. And that's something I'm very concerned about as well. And it's sort of a motivation for this channel in some ways, kind of indirectly. But I'm wondering how you see that division, and how you think that maybe spirituality or an understanding of neuroscience can help us to heal or lessen those divisions.
Oh,
or
yeah,
if they can.
No, I very much, I believe so. I loved a lot of what I've read from Brene Brown. She talks a bit about a number of us living in ideological bunkers where we have an affiliation with, people that have a common enemy, that connection has grown. We're more and more disconnected in our connectedness. And it's a real problem. I mean, I didn't include this in my bio, but I worked for about 10 years in US politics. I won't say which party I work for, but I don't affiliate with either party anymore. I hope the very best for them, and I hope for both sides and smaller political parties. My wife and I are living in Mexico now. I mean, it's a little bit more diverse in some of the political system here, but really, having worked 10 years in U.S. politics, I was a campaign manager, congressional campaign manager, and I seeing that division, just the inability to work together on almost anything. It was just heartbreaking. So I think coming from that place of seeing so much division, and wanting to be a part of a solution, I think I was drawn to neuroscience, but also to chaplaincy, where each person has their individual spirituality, sense of self, sense of meaning and purpose, being able to draw out where there's a place of healing, a place of connection. And to me, that was deeply healing, even amongst the real horrors of hospital trauma, that still being able to connect, finding common ground, even amongst differences, and that the neuroscience, especially, I think in terms of how we understand ourselves, social neuroscience is a whole area that's really kind of growing the last 10, 20 years. I probably pronounced his name, Casiopo, he and his wife, they doing a lot of really interesting work, partly on like loneliness, that people, loneliness is killing people. I mean, it's just, but also I think the divisions, in the United States, I think it's to some degree destroying us. And seeing things through a neuroscience lens, that if you look at the world, that quantum mechanics and so much of what they're discovering, we're all connected. One of the metaphors I talk about is the butterfly effect, that all of us have an infinite impact on everything. And that back in the 60s, a meteorologist was doing studies and found that if you changed a simulation of weather patterns, even like infinitely small, and as if like a butterfly was beating its wings in Brazil, it's going to cause hurricanes in China. So that's the metaphor, that each one of us has this infinitely impactful self that's changing everything, but that we all are interconnected. and that each one of us, even know how insignificant we are connected. So there's the neuroscience, or just science, that shows that we are connected and how we do connect. But then or look at like our 3 billion base pairs of genes, and we're 99.9% the same. Yet there's so much. I mean, so you could just spew off science galore, just saying we are so similar. Even our theological differences, most people believe in love and forgiveness, and what these theological or spiritual concepts mean for us. If you look at what those do, and I thought it was brilliant that you take the Dalai Lama and Desmond Tutu coming together to write a book that, if we practice these things, regardless of how we disagree. And they also, Richard Davidson, out of Wisconsin Madison, he's brilliant, and he's a Buddhist. So and he's saying so much that I think can draw us together as well. That there's so much to learn, and I find it so fascinating that if we define ourselves, I think, as separate, then what happens is these dualities, or however you want to call them, dichotomies, or these separations. But there's so much neuroscience that shows that no matter how separate we define ourselves, that we are still intimately entwined, and that even in our divisions, we're still entwined in our divisions. So my hope is that we can draw more together through neuroscience. And I think that is like a fundamental piece of, I think, my own healing, having worked in politics, to draw, I think, what we can to bring us more together. Because I think now more than ever, I think our future depends on it. It's really an existential, and it's only getting worse. I mean, and in some areas, there's really vocal people, like I mentioned, Brene Brown and others. But that's in some ways has only gotten worse since I was working. And so my hope, my prayer, my deepest desire is that, with neuroscience, with our differences, we can learn from one another. And I really think the neuroscience can draw us more together and show that, that genetically we're so similar, and that has to at least prompt the question, why? And if we're that similar, how can we not, at least to some degree, get along? And for my fellow Christians, and myself included, Jesus had mentioned the Good Samaritan, and Samaritans in his day were deeply hated and deeply divided. And if, so I really feel like, how can I be a better person by learning about these things, be less judgmental? And so but yeah, neuroscience. I think neuroscience for me, it was so enlightening, and I feel like, and there's just so much more. So anyway, that's probably all.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting you say that, because about a year ago or some time ago, earlier in the channel's history, I made some videos about political psychology, political divisions, and it had the same effect on me, learning about just the effect that being a member of a political party can bias the way that you process information about a given issue or policy. I did the same thing. I dropped my affiliation with the party that I won't mention which one it was. But yeah, same thing. I mean, I've been thinking about this issue for a long time, or for a few years at least. And I see the problems you're talking about. And I agree. I think that as we see how similar we are, it does prompt that question of why are we so divided on these particular points? I mean, why does the left see an issue this way and the right sees it this way? And I think we forget that we need to think about what people value and what they actually want, and why they're going for a certain method of going there. And maybe we're really trying to go to the same place, but we're just doing it in different ways. And I guess that I really appreciate that point about just the unity of us all. And it also made me think of, there's this term that gets thrown around in the kind of the prefrontal cortex researchers and the cognitive control, executive function people. They have this idea of the unity and diversity of cognitive control of these like executive functions. And it's a little bit of an abstract concept. it's kind of this idea that there's all these different, seemingly different functions that the prefrontal cortex is involved with, or that fall under the umbrella of executive functions, like inhibiting our impulses or working memory. And they seem different, but they all have some kind of unity to them. And so I was just, as you were speaking, that phrase kept coming into my head, like unity and diversity, or unity among diversity, maybe.
Sure,
I wonder if that's a theme for our conversation here.
yeah, and absolutely. I mean, I being a priest, and you coming from, more of an atheist side, that I don't want to disparage people that are working in politics. I think, that would be me dichotomizing and doing the very same thing that I'm, hoping to work beyond. That I think what you're allowing me, or allowing us to do, is say, there's a different way, and that it can be challenging in some of our neural circuitry, and some of the ways that can be habitual or part of our cultural systems, and finding inclusion, or all of those type things. But yeah, no, I think what you're saying, those two different sides, being able to kind of draw them together and say, there's a tension, but at the same time, it's something that it can also be collaborative. That there's still, amongst our divisions, or even the divisions of the way our brains work, that there can still be a way to draw different ways that our brains work, together. So
Yeah.
even like left brain or right brain, that some of the research coming out that lateralization, that it's still kind of new field, but as different as some of the research is showing, is that they still work together, as different as they are. That, I mean, there's so much that I think, like, learning from brain science, that can teach us more about ourselves, and even amongst those differences. So absolutely, no, I think those are excellent points that draw us back to that. I think the neuroscience is very inspiring. Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, I really appreciate your perspective on that. So another area that kind of related to what we're talking about, you recently, I think, had a video on the neuroscience of prejudice, and you explained that it's the source of our prejudice is basically our beliefs. Sometimes they're unconscious, but beliefs that we hold about other groups, or stereotypes, and that these lead us to make kind of false predictions and judgments about people who happen to be members of those groups. And so I was thinking we could discuss maybe a little bit of the neural circuitry involved in those processes, and how we might encounter that in ourselves. And we can speak generally. But, like, for example, you stressed the importance of you said this earlier, gaining access to our prefrontal cortex. And so why do you think that in particular is so important for avoiding prejudice?
I mean, our prefrontal cortex, our executive function, you mentioned, and then also, inhibitory aspects of our prefrontal cortex, but also, like, Newberg also talks about our frontal lobe being like the seat of our deepest concepts about ultimate reality, what many people would call God. That a lot of those concepts about ourself as well, we have a ventromedial and a dorsomedial prefrontal cortex, and that our dorsomedial is more about our more abstracted self. So that, I mean, there are very many aspects about that, but how we understand, our more immediate self, what's in it for me, what are rewards, but also understanding, what are other people, a theory of mind, who are other minds. Part of that theory of mind is coming from your dorsomedial prefrontal cortex, but working in conjunction with other parts, like your temporal parietal junction. So, I mean, there are many parts, but the prefrontal cortex, I think, is very key to prejudice. Semantic memory, partly being in our interior temporal lobes. So there are a number of areas, but I think the prefrontal cortex, like you're saying, it's very important to it. But largely, I think the inhibition, I think many of us, when we're starting to feel prejudice, our prefrontal cortex helps us say, no, at this moment, that's the wrong thing to say or to do. And that inhibitory action of the prefrontal cortex says, no, this person may have they might exhibited prejudice toward me, but I'm going to not retaliate and seek revenge or whatever it is. So there are many aspects to it, but I think what you're saying about the prefrontal cortex being a linchpin in terms of how we understand ourselves and the world and relate to it, and prefrontal cortex being toward our goals, desires, our hopes for the future, that especially if we can find combined hopes for the future, if we think more with our prefrontal cortex, we can rise above our habitualized patterns of aggression or revenge, and we can start thinking, I don't necessarily agree with this person. However, I know that if we don't agree to disagree, we're heading to disaster. So absolutely, I think the prefrontal cortex is so central, and us using our prefrontal cortex more, and understanding it too. I think the more we understand about our brains, I think the more we realize our limitations of our prejudice, but also can overcome that limitation. But absolutely, I think a linchpin being the prefrontal cortex.
Yeah, that's so interesting. And just a little point there on that you mentioned the ability to kind of intervene in our habitual responses using our prefrontal cortices. And just to add a little fine point on that, there's these kind of anecdotes in the prefrontal cortex literature, people who've had damage. I can't remember the exact subregion, but somewhere in the prefrontal cortex where they kind of lose that ability to change their habitual responses. So you'll find somebody. There's a story of a man who goes into he's at his doctor's house for some reason, and he just is in the bedroom, sees the bed, and immediately just undresses and gets in the bed. Like he's, that's just his habitual response. When he sees a bed, he gets in it. So, but that's off the topic, but just drawing our attention to the fact of how crucial this brain region is in changing our habitual responses. And if our habitual response is to see someone from a certain group, a certain racial group, or whatever it is, religion, we might, and our habitual response is to write that person off or assign certain qualities to them that they may or may not have, then our prefrontal cortex is going to be really important in changing our view of that person.
Absolutely.
Great.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, so I kind of want to move on to some sort of bigger philosophical, maybe theological questions. But before we do that, do you have anything else you want to say on particular neurotheology or neuroscience topics in general?
No, it's just been a lot of fun. I really appreciate the opportunity. So yeah, thanks for just the conversation. I hope it's a real joy for your viewers.
Oh, well, it's a joy for me, and I'm sure they'll get something out of it. So, all right. So we've talked about what is spirituality. We've talked about the difference between that and religion. And I want to return to these definitional questions because I think you mentioned it a little bit before, but what is faith to you? In your view, is it necessary to have faith to live a good life or a good afterlife, perhaps? How do you see faith? What is that to you?
Well, that's a big one. Yeah. So I think there's so many different ways to define it. I mean, like there are Christian definitions and then kind of more secular or, so yeah, I think a large point in terms of faith that I like to be a proponent of, and I think feel that I am, is that our faith is there's a practical side, a pragmatic side it is very much enacted. What we believe, what we feel, what our hopes are, that is an enormous part of what faith is, I think. There are different ways you could define faith. It's, our hopes, believing in which that's not seen, or, there's many different ways you could define faith, but I think a large piece of what I would I would say in terms of the larger conversation is that faith is largely defined by a pragmatism and also a performance and how it's enacted. I think something a number of Christians don't do is think about, if we are to go to heaven, like if we're to go to another place, what are we going to do there? Like how will we live there? And one of my favorite commentary on the Lord's Prayer, and the Lord's Prayer is, one part is, "Thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven." And it's not just to ask or pray or hope that God's will be done on earth, is that we are called to live in our faith, to enact our faith, to bring about God's kingdom of love and joy and peace. And definitely, I don't want to proselytize by any means, but just saying from a Christian perspective, I think there's a bit of a universality in that, that how we live, I think we're called to live our faith in terms of our ultimate reality, that, whatever we believe, I think we're drawn not just to hold it in our minds, but it is it is a pragmatic, performed faith. And I think that is a very important piece for me as a Christian, my understanding of Christianity. But I think what I was saying about that question about, what will we do in heaven? And if we go to heaven, I would think that we would, as a believer, I would think that we would follow God's will in heaven. We would offer joy and love, and it's not merely pie in the sky. But if we were to go into heaven, and if I'm going to go to heaven and be a jerk, I would just make it hell. So, and why would God allow for a place for me to go and be a jerk? And it would just be hell. So I think the question of, what is my faith, not only now, but as a person that believes in a world to come, how am I enacting my faith to live as if that place is also where I'm going to be doing what I'm supposed to be doing now? So I think a big piece of where I think neuroscience has a large place to teach, and Christians, but I think all of us, that people, Muslims, Buddhists, in a next life to believe, and not to advocate other religions, but to affirm that all of us walking more deeply toward our enacted faith, that we can all help each other, I think, find that common ground, find a more enacted faith. Because I think the neuroscience has really told us is that, whatever you believe, that's, if you just enclose that in your mind, that is something that is, highly to do with faith. But it's how that faith becomes enacted in the world. And that I think people of all different backgrounds, all different spiritual backgrounds, whether we're agnostic, we're atheists, different forms of atheism, if we're Buddhist, if we're Hindu, if whatever it is, that we can find common ground of enacting our performed faith in a way that's going to draw us all together and then make the world a better place. And the neuroscience, I think, shows that if our faith keeps us trapped in these silos, that we just keep killing one another, or hating one another, and not talking to one another, then our faith, we can't enact love in the same way. So and I hope that wasn't proselytizing by any means. It's more, I think the way I understand it, especially as a Christian, is to be accountable to my faith. Is if I am to believe something, it can't just be here. It has to be, what am I really doing? And if I'm going to believe in a world to come, and I'm not actually doing that in this life, from what Jesus says, I'm going to be very accountable of that. He talks about the sheep and the goats, that you're not even going to get in. I didn't even know you, Jesus says. And there's some really pretty, some dire things that, there's some very deep philosophical questions there. And so I think the question of faith is one it's a big question, but, and again, not to proselytize, but to really hold myself as a Christian more accountable, but also to use the neuroscience to draw us more together. What is our enacted faith? How do we perform our faith? We were talking about the prefrontal cortex. What are our deepest goals, our deepest desires? How do those draw us together in love and joy and kindness, forgiveness, all of these things? So I don't think I could give you a perfect answer of what faith is or what, and I don't want to proselytize what, I've chosen my answer, but, everyone on this channel is going to have a different perspective, and, and just, to find connection within that, and love one another in that. there's so much richness there, and I think I can enact my faith even more so by doing that. So yeah, I hope that wasn't a cop out, but
no, it's not. No, and I just want to say, I am just genuinely interested in your answers, and I don't think, I do appreciate your not trying to proselytize or anything, but also don't feel too constricted. I'd love to hear how you see it and what it means to you too. So I guess drilling down a little bit on that point, I think a lot of atheists, and myself in the past, have kind of been turned off by the term faith, because I think for a lot of us, it invokes this idea of belief without evidence, essentially, and or without what many would or what we might consider good evidence, depending on the point. But how do you see that kind of definition? Do you think that's too simplistic of a definition?
I think, yeah, it is like the Easter season for Christianity, and blessed are those who believe without seeing. And there's that whole aspect within Christianity, but there's certain things that challenge our prejudices, and that we learn something new. And people of faith, often taking a leap of faith, and then some of there's I can't remember his name at the moment, but Believing is Seeing is a new book out. Dr. G. Anyway, he talks about that we all have certain amounts of faith. Like, I think the best proximate answer for how much knowledge we have of the universe is maybe like 5%, and even that, like dark matter or dark energy, we don't even know what they are. We're just calling them that because it's like, I don't know what it is. No one knows what it is. They can kind of see it within mathematics and kind of how different things function. But I think there's a level of faith everywhere, and that's not to disparage anyone of any particular faith. That I think we all bring our prejudice, our cultural background, and I think as a person of faith, my own prejudice that limits my understanding and knowledge of truth, and that there are things we're going to disagree about. But faith is like a pejorative. Faith is you just don't have faith. You're an idiot or something terrible that just to draw us apart. That I think to a certain level we all have a perspective of faith that we're coming to. There's solipsism, and that no one has been able to definitively say that that no one's proved yet. I mean, there's all sorts of evidence that all sides can draw on and present, but still, even some of the best neuroscientists are saying, depending how you look on it, and ones that are agnostic or even atheists, you still can't prove it. There's no definitive. So no matter where we land, I think on the discussion of faith, we're all kind of making a bit of a leap. And some of us would say, I've looked at all this evidence, and I see your evidence maybe here, or not to disparage one another, but within maybe from an atheist perspective, they're saying, I've seen all these things, and no, I just can't. I can't go where you're going. Or the Christian might say, whatever it is, or the Buddhist, or so we're going to disagree on where the leap of faith is. But I think in terms of faith, considering how like incredibly ignorant we are about the universe, that we're all making very, I think, profound leaps of faith every day, and that those leaps of faith are ones that draw us closer toward our own particular truths. But my hope would be that we can draw toward a more collective truth, where we're all finding more truth. Where, as a Christian, when I see something that might necessarily challenge my faith, I want to necessarily maybe have a leap of faith to say, that wasn't helpful, or I can go to a new place, and that new place might be a little bit farther. But I think maybe even 1,000 years from now, or however far into the future, I would put my chips that we're probably never going to understand everything. I mean, maybe, I don't know. Who knows? There might be, depending on the religious perspective or a scientific or whatever, or the, bring it all together. It seems like, especially with the quantum mechanics, the more we know, the more weird it is. It just, like quantum tunneling, quantum entanglement, how all of these things, we feel like, oh yeah, we figured it out, and then there's this new thing, and it's just totally baffling. So I think I would argue that all of us, no matter where our perspective is coming from, that there is some level of leap of faith, and where we go with that leap of faith, I think depends on our, our cultural background. It depends on, our, education, so many factors, but, and not to be judgmental, but that I would say that we all have a particular faith. It's believing in that which is not seen, that, and it doesn't necessarily, just the idea of getting up in the morning, having faith that I'm not going to get hit by a meteorite, or that I'm not going to die, or, those are very small possibilities, but just going out and not getting hit by a car, or getting into a car, there's a certain level of faith. Getting on an airplane, getting into so many things. We're being faithful all the time. Sometimes our brain, I think, kind of shields us from, having too much deliberation over, oh my goodness, am I? And then there's, the mental health issues of some of us that have to, deal with anxieties, or, so. And a lot of those anxieties in our world are very real, that it's hard to have faith when we see so much evidence saying, but the very fact that we can, in a world that, we have this war going on now, we have the COVID pandemic, that we choose life, that we choose to love one another, despite our differences. I think there's a level of faith there that it doesn't necessarily have to be, the ultimate reality, that, there are things that I would say are faith. Anyway, so
yeah.
No,
And I think that's a very like universalist definition that I could probably get on board with too. No, that's very interesting. Well, I think we'll move on a little bit. We're getting somewhat close to our time, but one thing that you cover in one video is your view of free will, or how you see the issue of free will. What is that? What's your take on free will?
Wow. Well, you're just the big ones.
Yeah, these are easy questions, right?
Yeah, as if, there's so much written on it. I find it so fascinating. I'm one that does very much believe in free will. But you have, especially coming from a medical side, working in, multiple hospitals, seeing the ravages of, how we treat one another, how things become habitualized. We talked about prejudice within the debate of free will. I don't necessarily want to get into all the, libertarian and the compatibilist and all the other stuff, determinists. But I'm one who does believe in free will. And I think for me, it's more a question of what we do if we believe in free will. That some of the neuroscience that are atheists are finding that when you tell people that they have free will, the survey or the research actually shows they have more free will. Even if you were to say they don't have free will, they're materialists, they're whatever it is that their brain function, that if you tell people they have free will, in some of the research, and this is well documented, they're finding that people, when they believe in free will, they actually have more free will, even if you were to think they don't have free will. So for me, it's less the question of do we have free will, but more, where are you within your context? Each one of us has resources. I think I may have talked about Cicero in terms of one of my videos. That one of my favorite definitions of freedom is participation and power. And that I think what's most powerful in life is like love and joy and peace. And that if we can participate in these powers of love and joy and peace, the more we participate, and I had mentioned earlier about the social determinants of healthcare, that when you offer love and joy and peace and the power to engage in those things, you're going to give people more freedom. And if you believe in more freedom, giving people more freedom in those things, they're going to have more freedom. And that is the truth that they're seeing within neuroscience, regardless of whether or not you even have freedom. So I think the debate, I think a lot of people can get lost in the debate, and conclusively, no one's really, I don't think either side, even within the religious framework, you have like the compatibilists of like a middle knowledge, or God's giving a certain level of free will, but God knows what we'll choose. So so even that is, a number of people found that problematic. So within even the theological framework of it, it's still, I think many theologians are like, no, well, it's not really, there's no definitive. It's, without so yeah, exactly. So what I'm saying is that if you look at the neuroscience, a lot of what we're seeing is that if you believe in free will, you're going to have more free will. And if you want to offer others more freedom, which I would define as participation and power, you're going to enable people to be more free. And that freedom, to me, has to be grounded in love and joy and peace, and what I would call the fruit of the Spirit, but valued in virtues and morality and all of that type of freedom. And that, as we see, like, the effects of prejudice, the effects of hatred, the effects, and for ourselves included, like, whether or not whatever we believe the world to be, that if we can find forgiveness, we find for ourselves and others, there's a certain unbinding of what that was bound, either toward our own sense of shame, maybe, or our own sense of revenge, that, that we're the power to hate, that we're lost. And I think to some degree that the argument itself, I think we get stuck. And that I think just taking what's beyond the argument is if we can say, hey, if we just believe in freedom, offering freedom, and then exercising it so that we can all kind of have more freedom, we're going to be more free, even if we're not free. And I think that's what it boils down to me, is that it almost doesn't, and then obviously not, it doesn't matter, but as we disagree, it almost matters more that we believe together in freedom than fighting about whether or not we are free and offering that freedom. So anyway,
yeah,
no, it's a great question. It's a really hard topic. I love that you're asking me, like, what is faith? What is freedom? Really getting into yeah, I'm sure your audience, these are our existential questions, ones we hope to, I think, grapple with and, provide more freedom for ourselves. I mean, neuroscience, I think, provides each of us more freedom. Knowledge is power. The more we know about ourselves, the more we can offer others that knowledge and power and ennoble them to be more free. So I think there's something very liberating about all of it. And your channel, I think, offers freedom to know more about, who we are, what we are. So no, these are great questions, and wow, yeah, thank you.
well, likewise, and I love your answer. It's for me, I come down on, I sort of get convinced by this materialist argument, physicalist argument, that ultimately there may not be such a thing as free will. But I come back to your attitude with this is how I feel that does that really matter? Because as you mentioned, some of those studies seem to suggest that believing in free will, we maybe have more ability to make decisions about our lives. And I always remember the story about William James, the father of American psychology, who he did this little experiment on himself because he was grappling with this question. And he said, okay, well, I don't remember how long the time period was, but he said, for this certain amount of time, I'm just going to believe that every single choice I make, every decision is my own, and that I'm in control of my fate. And he said that was one of the most transformative experiences he ever had in his life. And I think he did believe in free will, but sort of along similar lines that you were suggesting. I'd have to look back at it exactly, but it was basically that point. And similarly, last week I talked with actually another YouTube guy, Ryan Rhodes. He's a cognitive scientist, and he came on a different perspective, but we came to basically the same conclusion. And I think, I think you could argue with it. You could say, well, it's not fully consistent. And I might have to agree that our logic maybe not fully consistent, but that's where I land with it too, is, well, it seems to be a useful concept in my life. I mean, and in other people's lives, when we believe that we're free, it seems to make a difference. So why not, have that belief? And maybe that's a kind of faith that I engage in.
Sure.
So, okay. So we've talked about some little questions like faith and free will. And let's, I think you've probably answered this through speaking about the fruit of the Spirit, but I just want to pin it down. I mean, what do you think is the single most important value or quality of mind that we should try to cultivate in our lives, whether that's through a spiritual practice like meditation or prayer, or simply, trying to change yourself in some way?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing that would come to mind would just be being more mindful, overcoming our habitual patterns. I had mentioned that definition. Jeffrey Schwartz, one of my favorite authors, he defines mindfulness as having a third person perspective of your first person experience. So the more we can kind of go to the balcony and look at ourselves, I think the more we cultivate that, I think the farther away we can get from living in our habitual patterns, our own prejudice, that if we can get beyond just living out an unconscious existence, that we can have more freedom. And that if we can, and that mindfulness, I think to some degree, is informed by a higher sense. That third person perspective is, I talked about the dorsal medial prefrontal cortex, that our more abstracted sense of ourselves. Different traditions would define it differently. That someone Jewish might find it as this still small voice of God, or you could define it as our conscious, our inner light, our inner compass. But the more mindful we become, the more we start using that prefrontal cortex, inhibiting more of our, quick, automatic, unconscious habits. So being mindful, I think, drawing us more of that abstracted sense of kind of the decentering our like self, maybe a small s, or there are different ways of describing it, but getting to that large sense of self and within more of a like a secular atheist perspective, that if I can think of what will future generations think of me, that abstracted sense of self, what will my life mean 1,000 years from now, 100 years from now, and having that mindfulness of kind of detaching from that real nitty gritty, reactive, all that other stuff, to a more, what is my wiser self, my wiser advocate of my mind, even thinking of myself 20 years from now, or 10 years, or even 5 years from now, what would that self think of me? And getting to that point more often. And then, as you're saying, like the prefrontal cortex being, so important in all of this, if we can use our higher ability to think about ourselves, get out of those habitual patterns, largely that are based on confrontation or sense of revenge, or habitual, or so much of that. And I think people of all faiths, all backgrounds, spiritualities, wherever it's coming from, that cultivating those parts of the brain, having a greater sense of a theory of mind. I talked about earlier that the more we have a sense of the other, the more we have, we're able to project, what is this person thinking? We're able to empathize more. So yeah, being more mindful, I think, to like just as one term, one idea, there are a lot of different facets, I think, to it. But I think all of us can get to I think a better place of cooperation and being less reactive. And I mean, even if we disagree on what mindfulness is, where, what's the source of that mindfulness? Is it a gift of the Holy Spirit? Is it within Buddhism, a mindful awareness? Is it my evolutionary biology that, pro-social behaviors gave me this ability to, project and understand the other, whatever your source is. And, not everyone's going to agree upon this, but I think largely coming from that, from a chaplain, but also as a priest, that, that we are to love one another. And to me, that is to transcend all of these more base reactionary pieces of ourself, and get to a higher level of saying, I might disagree with this person, maybe like very fundamentally. I might even like this person somehow, but I can love them. I can agree with, I find something that I can agree with them on, and we can work together to a shared sense of reality. But it's only, I think, with mindfulness that we're going to get there, no matter what our background is. So these are great questions, Andrew. I really having fun. I'm glad I hope the comments, what other people, what they're thinking about these things and where they draw their,
Yeah.
what is the one thing for them too? What is the one thing that draws them into a sense of, that maybe that one thing.
Yeah, that's a great idea. I'd love to hear that in the comments. What's the most important value or quality of mind? And no, I think your answer is beautiful. I mean, I really agree with it. Well, the last question I have is, if somebody could read only one book about, I mean, take your pick, whether brain, spirituality, however, if someone, and maybe we'll take it out of the realm of religion. But if somebody could read only one book about, let's say, the brain or neurotheology, what would you recommend?
Oh, that's a toughie. Yeah. I mean, there's so many good books and within genres. I mean, for people of a particular faith background, I would recommend a particular book over another. Yeah, if I had to choose one, that's really hard. I mean, because they all teach something different. I mean, I wouldn't want to just say read my book because it's very much a
That's
Christian.
allowed.
And then all the proceeds of my book go to the children's hospital where I used to work. So and there's nothing about mine that, if you allow this, I'd say if you want a Christian perspective, I'll say read my book. But if you were to read any other book, I would say probably read Andrew Newberg. And I'm totally violating your question, but as another, if you want maybe a more, no, I would say read, Neurotheology by Newberg. If you want, that's one of his more later books, kind of describing the genre. It's only 2 or 3 years old, and he's kind of saying, what are some of the, but one of the ones that I first read, How God Changes Your Brain, I think I would also, I would say read, if you want a really Christian, maybe read my book. But if you want something more interfaith, kind of draw it together, even a secular, and then that's what I think is really beautiful about Dr. Newberg, is that, it's not pushing anyone out, that, it's drawing us all together, that, regardless of how we disagree on some very fundamental things, that there are some things that they're learning through neuroscience. So I would say one of those two by him. So I kind of cheated, but hopefully.
No, that's great. That's great. That makes sense. Yeah. Well, I think he does tend to bring people together, and I think he had some hand in bringing us together some indirect way today. So, Bryan, it's been a real pleasure and wonderful speaking with you. I hope we can do it again in the future, and thank you so much for coming on.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, and really appreciate the time together. Appreciate the tough questions, just going right down into it.
Yeah, that's how we do it. Well, thanks so much.
Okay, take good care.
You too. All right, well, that's it. Thank you so much for listening to or watching this episode of Sense of Mind. Please be sure to like and subscribe to the YouTube channel and subscribe to the podcast. Also consider giving this show a 5-star rating on whatever podcast platform you use. Also consider signing up for our newsletter by going to senseofmindshow.com/newsletter. As always, this channel is brought to you by the Diamond Mind Foundation. This episode was written and produced by me, Andrew Cooper Sansone. Thank you so much for watching. I'll catch you next time.